Welcome back to Peerless Martial God. Enjoy. Chapter 6. The Arrow Spirit. The Yunhai sect was surrounded by 8 mountain peaks. Each of these mountains was connected with the other in perfect harmony. Yunhai sect's disciples could thus easily go to these high-altitude mountain peaks. These mountains, which made the region a blessed heaven, were filled with caves where disciples could go and concentrate on their training in peace. These mountains were extraordinarily high and covered a vast area. Going to these mountains was therefore an easy way to find peace and tranquility for cultivation. Lin Feng was walking over a precipice decorated by overhanging rocks. He was surrounded by perilous cliffs and precipices. When looking around him, he could see a boundless sea of clouds. Such a sight would make anyone feel carefree, relaxed and joyful. However, Lin Feng did have the heart to enjoy the sight. He had been uninterruptedly practicing the sword unsheathing skill over and over again. Boom, was the sound emitted by the stones under Lin Feng's sword each time he hit them. Lin Feng's sword left a long and slender opening in the stones each time it hit. Lin Feng had already been training for 7 days. He had been training without rest, which could be seen by the varying sword marks on each stone. Sword unsheathing was a skill which required developing 2 aspects, speed and power. These 2 were the ultimate goal of the practice. At the moment of unsheathing the sword, a strong power was also necessary. As far as the angle at which the sword had to be unsheathed is concerned, unsheathing it at irregular angles was also necessary. Indeed, pulling it out using predictable patterns could put the user at the enemy's mercy, as he could guess what the next movement would be. The sword unsheathing skill was definitely not a regular technique. Lin Feng was dripping with sweat because he had been training every day from morning to evening. Uninterrupted practice was the only way to increase his strength. Persistently repeating the movements required a tenacious and incomparable willpower and determination. That was the only way to become stronger on the path of cultivation. Lin Feng hadn't forgotten his previous life. He couldn't forget. Although that world was filled with lofty sentiments and righteous ardor, one also had to go through hardships in that world. Being weak and lacking power could lead to getting killed. Weak and powerless, that sounded like what Lin Feng was when he almost got killed by Lin Heng. However, Lin Feng's dark spirit was gaining in vitality every minute, like he is in a trance state. He then stopped practicing the skill for a moment and recalled his spirit back into his body. The spirit was the cultivator's soul and it had to be cherished. Unceasingly using it consumed one's vital essence too much. Lin Feng put his sword back into its sheath. The sheath was made of a ferocious animal skin which had a sparkling gem embedded. Then, he started training again, but this time he practiced the moonlight feather agility technique. The sun, which was once high in the sky, was now sinking into the horizon. Lin Feng rested for a while looking at the sea of clouds making wave-like motions. On his face was a resplendent smile. He then unsheathed the sword and held it forward, watching the dark red light from the sunset slowly move down the sword, imagining it as blood flowing endlessly. He felt like a god looking down upon creation. This place gave him a view of the surrounding mountains, and the aura he was currently emitting was one of strength with a ruthless coldness beneath. It's about time to find a cave to practice. Lin Feng rested for a while, then got up and walked over to the mountains. It wasn't long until Lin Feng found a few caves for cultivation. They were always occupied by other people though. Then, Lin Feng arrived in a valley where a mountain stream was flowing. He decided to walk along the mountain stream when something drew his attention and made him stop walking. A ray of sunlight between these mountains. Before him were 2 peaks. The middle of these 2 peaks looked like the marks he left when hitting rocks with his sword. It looked very narrow in between, as if the path could only accommodate 2 people walking side by side. The path looked as narrow as the ray of sunlight. I wonder what there is over there, Lin Feng thought to himself. He then moved closer with curiosity. It seemed that the mountain stream and the ray of sunlight came from the same place. At a distant place, 2 disciples saw Lin Feng move towards that ray of sunlight. They couldn't help but laugh at him and criticize him. That piece of trash is not very lucky. He doesn't seem to know that is the place where our senior sister Lu Fei trains. It is quite surprising that he dares go in there. Lu Fei's strength is incomparable to ours. She is much stronger than we are, much stronger than most of our fellow disciples, a true genius. Senior sister is the only correct way of addressing a genius such as her. While the 2 disciples were whispering, Lin Feng had already walked several hundred meters into the area where the ray of sunlight was coming from and finally arrived. Before his eyes opened up a wide panorama. That place was one of exceptional charm and was extremely vast. On the left was a gigantic lake out of which silk-like hot steam was evaporating. It surprisingly seemed to be a natural hot spring. It's such a nice place, I could have bath. Lin Feng's clothes were sticking to his skin as he had been sweating heavily. He took off his top and directly jumped into the natural hot spring. So comfortable. Lin Feng was filled with happiness when he suddenly heard a noise coming from somewhere in the water. Suddenly, he saw a girl's head come out of the water. Her hair looked very soft. It was a 15 to 16-year-old young girl. She had arched eyebrows and a delicate oval face. She was very beautiful. In this world, female cultivators were very beautiful because they cultivated purer bodies. She was a charming natural beauty and certainly didn't need to put makeup on. Nonetheless, that young girl's eyes didn't make her look very amicable. Her eyes were filled with flames of anger. Lu Fei was holding her breath and practicing in the water. She was very surprised to see another Yun Hai sect's disciple. Even more, she couldn't stand seeing him without his top in the water where she practiced every day. "I'm sorry, I didn't know someone was in here," said Lin Feng with an apologetic smile. He then got out of the water and recognized the most beautiful female fellow disciple. Lu Fei's expression hadn't changed though, and she still looked furious. Who didn't know this was Lu Fei's training place after all? Who didn't know the Sunray Mountain was Lu Fei's? That pervert had willingly come with the intention of seducing her. Lin Feng really didn't know someone was there though. In his previous life, Lin Feng was a coward and had never ever come to that side of the region to train. Even though Lu Fei was extremely beautiful, Lin Feng, who indeed did think she was alluring, really had no hidden intentions. He put on his clothes at lightning speed and started leaving. "And where do you think you're going?" heard Lin Feng. That was Lu Fei's voice coming from behind him as he was leaving. Lu Fei had said that with a cold and detached voice. Lin Feng turned around and saw Lu Fei holding a bow and an arrow in her hands. "Where do you think?" said Lin Feng, looking at her angrily. He didn't intend to seduce her. It was a mere misunderstanding and nothing more. Also, he had apologized already. She didn't reply. Lu Fei's bewitching body adopted a battle-ready position. She pulled back the arrow placed in the bow in a position ready to shoot. She was ready to let it go. She shot the arrow, which made a whistling sound. The golden arrow broke the air and thrusted towards Lin Feng. How strong! Lin Feng stared at the arrow as it was moving towards him. He had absolutely no hesitation and started his 9 heavy wave technique. Heavy wave explosions were heard while the arrow was getting closer and closer to him. At the moment when the arrow approached so near that it was about to reach him, the arrow and the 9 heavy waves collided. The arrow collapsed into the waves, hung up in the air for a few seconds before falling onto the ground. "Do you want to kill me?" said Lin Feng, whose voice was filled with rage. That arrow had a 7,000 Jin power. If it had been Lin Feng's previous life, he would have been dead already. "Yes, so what?" said Lu Fei while pulling out another arrow. An illusory golden arrow suddenly appeared by her side. Lin Feng was shivering out of fear. A sensation of cold spread throughout his body. The illusory arrow was facing him. The illusory arrow was a guided arrow, which meant it could detect if someone was alive and automatically aim at them. The arrow could automatically aim at breathing people. That was one of the particular characteristics and abilities of those who possessed the arrow spirit. The bowstring emitted a noise while the twinkling arrow moved towards him, getting closer and closer. Moonlight feather agility, Lin Feng jumped 10 meters backwards. Lin Feng had sent another wave into which the golden arrow crashed, what looked like an explosion, but that time the wave had for sole effect to slow down the arrow. It didn't stop it. The noise coming out of the collapse was scary and made Lin Feng's heart palpitate. The arrow was going straight towards Lin Feng's forehead. Lu Fei stood out from her Yun Hai sect's fellow disciples and was considered to be out of the ordinary, to be an outstanding disciple. She had reached the 9th chi layer. Using her arrow spirit, her strength could exceed 9,000 Jin. Thus, Lin Feng's 9 heavy waves was obviously not enough to stop her arrow. Lin Feng fell down because of the energy released by the clash of the wave and the arrow. As Lu Fei's arrow spirit could control the arrow, which by the way made the arrow seem alive, she made it turn around and continued to try and kill him. "Ah!" shouted Lin Feng. Suddenly, the twinkling arrow vanished in a bright white light. "I, Lin Feng, will always remember this." The distant voice stupefied Lu Fei. She looked around only to see her arrow cut into 2. Lin Feng had already disappeared from the place. He had left at an amazing speed. "This is the arrow light," whispered Lu Fei. The 2 disciples who had watched the scene all along saw Lin Feng escape. They couldn't help but be seized with terror. Lu Fei surprisingly hadn't killed that piece of trash. Maybe Lu Fei was unwilling to fight and kill him. They had seen Lu Fei's wet clothes stick to her body. They thought about how graceful her body was. She was filled with endless charm. It made them gulp with desire. The only way for them not to drool was to keep their mouth closed. The only thing they could do was to peep and enjoy such a rare scenery. Everyone knew that Lu Fei was very powerful. Within the Yun Hai sect, many people courted her. There were some extremely skillful disciples who courted her. The 2 disciples who had just been peeping at her couldn't match with these extremely skillful disciples. If anyone learnt that they had seen Lu Fei's utterly attractive body, they would be killed in a very ugly way. End of chapter 6. Hope you guys enjoy the chapter. Please consider subscribing and hit that bell button for future updates.